know that the last couple of years haven't always been easy to keep an organization like this together, let alone just to deal with going to law school. So I want to thank Catherine McCarthy, James Butler, Jack Sanner, and Sydney Laughlin for helping to coordinate the meeting. Of course, extremely honored and pleased to have Professor Tsai moderating the discussion. So all the people in Washington of the office are well aware of the great chapter. I just want to take a minute to tell you about what we're doing with regard to assisting people like you, and if you want clerkships, if you want to seek a clerkship, because our friends on the right have been pretty efficient at this over the years through the Federalist Society, and we wanted to bring up the game a little bit. So we hired somebody who would really particularly focus on this. And so we had a clerkship call last week, Zoom call, that went over the nuts and bolts of clerkship applications for state and federal courts, including selecting a court and judges, cover letters, resumes, and recommendations. And there are going to be a number of opportunities throughout this year, including the opportunity to apply for what we call a clerkship mentor. This winter or early spring, you will have the opportunity to apply for a clerkship mentor through ACS, or to be part of our special outreach cohort. So the mentors will be lawyers in our network who have clerked, and we'll do our best to match people with a mentor who clerked in a court in which you are interested. The special outreach cohort members will include approximately 30 excellent students at ACS as identified as future progressive legal leaders. And these students are going to get additional advice on where their applications and on which judges to apply for, and where possible connections with former clerks and direct outreach from ACS to some judges on their behalf. For both programs, being a chapter leader is a plus, but not required. And though you must be an ACS member to apply. All of our so-called next generation leaders who apply are guaranteed a mentor and spot in the cohort. So make sure you're receiving ACS emails to get all the information on these upcoming calls and opportunities. The person we've hired, who's just doing an incredible job on this, really mentoring very effectively, is named Thea Cohen. She is ACS's Director of Strategic Engagement. She's available to speak to chapters on programs about clerkships and help you coordinate panels with alums who have clerked, and in some cases judges. She can also meet with individual students to talk about application strategies. She's done this with over 100 people. So you can reach out to her directly at tcohen@acslaw.org. And just two quick save the date things, because finally we can do things in person. I started the job on March 9th, 2020. So you can imagine what a not in-person experience had it been for a long time. So we've been trying for 3 years to have our annual student convention at Arizona State University, and they've been patient, and finally on March 31st through April 1st, that will be held in Phoenix. And our national convention will be held at the Capitol Hilton in Washington on May 18th through the 23rd. And we do have scholarship applications available to help with the financial aspect of attending. So just wanted to say that to the chapter people, and Professor, go ahead.
Everybody take notes? Okay. Well, it's my great pleasure to participate in this conversation with Senator Feingold and his co-author, Peter Prindiville. This is the book, The Constitution in Jeopardy. It's a book that is written in lively prose about a matter that is quite urgent, and also a subject that is not far from, I think, the minds of most law students, which is the subject of constitutional change, right? How do you do it, either formally or informally? And of course, what are the downsides, the trade-offs from pursuing one method over another? We're going to talk about all these issues. I just want to simply say that I hope you guys have questions. We're going to save some time toward the end for your questions, and we just hope to have a kind of ongoing conversation about some of the very interesting things raised in this book. Now, let me just begin by saying that much of the book is focused on the main part of the U.S. Constitution that sets out the procedure for fundamental change of that document, right? Article 5 of the Constitution. And just so that we're all on the same page, that provision of the U.S. Constitution says that changes to the document can be proposed one of two ways. One is if both houses of Congress, right, by a two-thirds threshold, believe that a change should be made, that can be proposed. The other method is that through a kind of application process, it's a little bit unclear here, and I'm going to ask the authors to tell us a little bit more about this. It's not really ever been actually successfully utilized, but it's there. It's a legacy of popular sovereignty, our tradition of popular sovereignty. But it says that if two-thirds of something, of conventions apply, then it sounds like Congress also needs to call for a national convention to consider some sort of changes. And of course, the ratification threshold is higher. And it explicitly says that the states are involved at that stage, that the change would be ratified and made complete if 3/4 of the states approve such a change. Now, of course, there have been parts of our in American history where that's actually happened. There have been many times where it has been attempted and failed, and there have been what I would consider workarounds at various times, different strategies developed to advance constitutional change without formal constitutional amendment. All of these things the authors get into. But I think that, first of all, I just want to briefly describe what I see to be the two main arguments that you have in the book. And then I also want to then invite you to talk a little bit about how we got to the compromise in the first place, how we got to Article 5. The two main threats, right, the Constitution and Jeopardy, that the authors make are the following. First, they're worried, they want you to know that there is a real danger that, particularly with respect to this convention process, has never quite been successfully used, that there is an ongoing effort on the part of the right mobilizing to take advantage of that process and use it successfully for the first time. And they say that this would involve, though, a hijacking of Article 5 for factional gain. The second main thesis that I see in the book is they also, though, recognize that Article 5 is too hard. And here they seem to be in accord with much of the academic criticism, including some things I've written, that the risk from having too difficult a method of changing the Constitution, most people think ours is among the hardest in the world to change formally, is the risk of ossification of our basic law. So those are the two main theses I see in the book. We're going to kind of get into that, dig a little deeper in there. But I wanted to start just by asking you guys decide who wants to answer what questions. But first of all, take us through just very briefly how we got to this peculiar compromise in terms of how we propose changes and how they're ratified.
I'll kick it off by talking about the Constitutional Convention itself, and then Peter has some very interesting things to say about how we got to that point. So obviously, the convention had to start in Philadelphia with something, and the Virginia plan was laid on the table, and it included a lot of really interesting and important things, but one thing it said was, there shall be the opportunity for a convention to change the Constitution, and the national government shall have nothing to do with it. That was the original, if you will, anti-federalist type of proposal. That was then sent to what was called the Committee on Detail, who apparently met in that hot room too. I don't know, I was just over there the other day with my grandson in that little room where they did this. And it was a terribly hot summer, but they poured over these different drafts and ideas, and they came back out near the end, not long before they finally finished, and said, well, we're going to have Congress say that there are enough applications for a convention, but that Congress would be required, mandated to call the convention. So that's how it came out. But a guy named Alexander Hamilton said, no. He said, we're not having this. The national government should be the one to do this. If the states do it, they'll just be craven about their own interest. And only the national government could really have the wisdom through its elected representatives to do it right. And so he persuaded by a 9-to-1 vote to have it only be congressional proposals for constitutional amendments. So no convention. And then a guy named George Mason, famous anti-federalist, said basically in modern language, we're out of here then. Well, they couldn't let that happen. It was late in the process. Benjamin Franklin said earlier, if we don't hang together, we'll certainly all hang separately. That was more about the revolution. But they had to cut a deal. And so they reinserted the language that would allow this application by 2/3 of the states, now 34 states, then it was much fewer, that would then go to Congress, and Congress doesn't get to say, okay, let's have a vote about whether we think this is a good idea. It is a ministerial act, we believe. And so that's how this really it's a tension, as we write in the book, between sort of a nationalist, strong federal government view of Hamilton and the classic anti-federalist view of Mason and others. And that's how we got this rather unusual mixture. Peter?
And it's clear, right from the beginning that even those who were present at the 1787 convention thought that maybe Article 5 wasn't perfectly drafted, which if you think about it makes complete sense. This is the first attempt in world history to create a constitutional amendment mechanism that for a national constitution that wasn't premised on unanimity like the Articles of Confederation were. So I mean, this was truly in the vanguard, and they were experimenting with some really complicated questions of political theory and new understandings of constitutionalism and popular sovereignty. But James Madison remarked in his notes, even, some scholars debate this, but either at the convention or shortly thereafter, that the convention mechanism of Article 5 was flawed because there were insufficient, in his words, constitutional regulations as to form and quorum. He noted even at that point that, wait a second, this last-minute compromise between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist views, Hamilton embracing a Federalist conception of constitutional change, a very powerful congressional role in the amendment process, Mason adopting a more Anti-Federalist view, saying that we should have bottom-up means for change, that this last-minute compromise was perhaps not well struck. Russ brings up also, the work of the convention, the 1787 convention, we argue, occurred kind of along a backdrop of new American understandings of constitutional change. So we start the book actually not with the 1787 convention, but we started a decade prior. We start during the Revolutionary War, and we ask the question, what did the earliest Americans think about formal constitutional change? How did they even conceive of it? Because if you think about it, it really was a novel idea. If you make the noble claim that we're going to throw off the yoke of the king as sovereign, we're going to replace the people, and we're going to ground this new political entity in written fundamental law, you have to have a way to change it. Because otherwise, you run the risk of a very bloody governing regime. There were some political theorists argued at the time that the only way to change a constitution was to overthrow it. And so, if you desired to change the legal regime, you necessarily there was a very bloody nature to constitutional change. And we argue that the early Americans, the revolutionary generation, wanted to do away with this. That here you could make change with law rather than with blood. But that some of these early attempts really kind of missed the mark, and that's part of our core thesis.
So that's a great overview, I think, and it brings us back to these compromises. But as you know, every compromise is a mix of high principle as well as sort of the raw practical problems that they faced at that time. And so on the one hand, at the level of broad philosophy, they're trying to design a system, right, where it's hard enough to do big change. You want to be able to ensure that there is broad and deep support for the change. Otherwise, you just have one faction, as you guys described, right, implementing its narrow agenda into fundamental law. On the other hand, if you make it too hard, as you're suggesting, you have a different set of problems altogether. Doesn't that violate this great principle of popular sovereignty that they're appealing to in a sense, overthrow the Articles of Confederation, right? Now, I want you guys to focus on the more concrete things, though, because there were at least two, right, that seemed to be part of this compromise. One was slavery, and two is a concern by those states that wanted to walk out the door, right, about the equality of the states. These seem to be the two things, and they're connected, obviously, at least as far as the dissenters were thinking about them. But so talk about this a little bit. How much did this shape it, and how much it should affect how we think about how the thresholds are struck now?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's always painful to talk about, but when we talk about George Mason and people being concerned that there needs to be a convention mechanism, it isn't, as you say, just high principle. There was a tremendous fear that if 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate and then 3/4 of the states decided to abolish slavery, certain states would be a little unhappy. Let's face it, you know that drove so much of this flawed document, which ACS calls the founding failure. So when I say George Mason meant we're going to be out of here, that's pretty much what they were talking about more than anything else, as well as a general fear, of course, of too strong of a federal government. But the professor is correctly referring to the text of Article 5 here, I think, when he talks about equal representation of the states. I love starting my course on the United States Senate and the Constitution by saying, what's the one thing you can't change in the Constitution, as it says in Article 5? There are two things in there. Of course, when we change the Constitution, we don't really excise the language that was there before. So it still says 3/5 man in the Constitution itself. But there also says in there were two provisions that could not be amended in Article 5 that had to do with fugitive slave, pro-slavery. But what remains, the only thing that can't be changed, is what? It's always stump classes. This is good. You can get rid of the president. You can get rid of the Supreme Court. You can take away the various judicial powers. There's only one thing you can't change: the equal representation in the Senate. Every state gets the same number of senators. So it's at least technically unamendable. I mean, there was interesting things that men like Akil Lamar and others have talked about, kind of unusual ways you might deal with it. But this was, of course, one of the critical compromises. It wasn't just that you would have the two houses and one would be based on population and one would be based on the states, but that literally the states would have equal representation. So that was central to not really just Article 5, but it was central to the whole deal, wasn't it?
Indeed. Okay. Well, so now that we're focused on sort of the high threshold that's created, creating the high threshold for both proposal and for ratification seems to be part of this compromise that makes the dissenters feel a little bit more comfortable, as well as the convention mechanism as a kind of fail-safe, right? If they don't like the direction of the government, then maybe they can do something in response. I wonder if we could reflect now a little bit more broadly on these high thresholds and how we should think about this in a modern sense, because at least from one perspective, while they throw a bone to George Mason and others, right, didn't Hamilton sort of win? It really is hard to use not just the convention mechanism, but that all of Article 5 is hard to use. What about that view of things?
Well, I mean, it was again clear even right then in the state ratification debates. You know, and the anti-federalists said, you know, really, Article 5 is going to be the means to control this new Leviathan? Clearly, it's too challenging. You know, they saw Article 5 as somewhat of a paper promise for, and thus argued vehemently against ratifying the new document. So the whole notion that the thresholds in Article 5 are too onerous and particularly high and too onerous is hardly a new one. I think you know, there's no debating that the thresholds are high. I think that can be useful comfort for those who might generally have a more conservative approach to constitutional change, saying that we should, you know, go back to the motherboard rarely and with a certain, you know, gravitas. But we also argue that sometimes the high thresholds can cause those in the political establishment to ignore Article 5 altogether. That because it's so hard to amend the Constitution, people basically assume that Article 5 is a dead letter. And we call this in the book the archaics, the idea that some people see parts of the Constitution as so disused as to be almost dead. For example, people saw the Second Amendment that way for a long time, yet movements to reimagine the Second Amendment, while many thought it was dead, these movements were alive and well and were vigorously positing another theory. Many today argue that Article 5 is likewise either dead or on life support, simply because it is so hard. They see the three-quarters bar and thus assume that Article 5 isn't worth much focus. But we argue that it's really just another one of these archaics. It's one of these elements of the Constitution, our Constitution and our constitutional tradition that is too often overlooked, and thus room is made for people to start reimagining it in ways that can be disadvantageous to national interests.
Yeah, and I would just add that, we are somewhat directly critical of the legal establishment, the progressive establishment, many of whom are my friends and allies throughout my life, for having this tendency, particularly on the left, of discounting things that could happen. A little bit less of it now, needless to say. But, actually, when I was an undergraduate, I was taking undergraduate constitutional law. And this is in the 70s, so the professor is very cleverly and appropriately explaining that, the 14th Amendment is now, the Bill of Rights is now being applied to the states under the 14th Amendment, and all these rights are now what go for the states. And I was not a guy that talked a lot. I believe it or not, I was a guy in the back. But I said, well, what about the Second Amendment? What about the right to bear arms? And he, a very distinguished professor, said, oh, that's for the government. Oh, wait, Bill of Rights, something was for the government. And I realized, and I wrote my thesis on this, that there was a tremendous danger here. Or, if you like the idea, that if this is examined in a certain way, that it could lead to a conclusion that there's an individual right to bear arms. And the left and the establishment simply dismissed it. And we see this tendency with regard to the convention. It takes three-quarters, Constitution's pretty much the way it is now. The Supreme Court makes these decisions, and you made sort of a reference to this. We have professors, particularly at Yale Law School, who are considered some of the finest professors of our time, Reva Siegel and William Eskridge, who say, well, actually, because even though the ERA didn't pass, there's been so many movements that have effectively created these protections for women's rights. Or he says there are super statutes that are so strongly embedded in our culture, in our law, that no one would undo them. That's all wrong. And these are wonderful people who are devastated, because what has happened is all the things they said have been undone by the reality that this Supreme Court can do this, and potentially a constitutional convention could go either way, could do the same. So I don't want to call it smugness, that's not fair. But they were trying to explain the developments of the 20th century and the law after the Warren Court in a way that simply was not the same as real constitutional change, in my view.
Right.
And so, if I might, just about the three-quarters. So I think there's, as I see it, there's kind of two issues with the three-quarters. One is it can cause people to just ignore Article 5 and not have not assess its potential or its possible potential or the risks. But I think the other thing too is, history teaches that sometimes, especially on constitutional questions, our read of the political environment can be a little wrong. And also people can think of these questions as kind of tracking generally accepted understandings of the political landscape, whereas in reality, Article 5 vests power in state legislatures. And so sometimes things can cut in strange ways. Take, for example, the apportionment rulings that inspired an almost successful call in the 60s, Reynolds versus Sims, Baker versus Carr. There was great backlash against the apportionment rulings led by Senator Dirksen, and came within one vote. We came within one application of a successful call for an Article 5 convention. Well, ask yourself, how could this be? I mean, the apportionment rulings were a high point of democracy. They were ensuring that one person meant one vote. Well, it was an issue that dealt peculiarly with state legislatures. It was the apportionment rulings had to do with state legislative districts. So Article 5 vests a lot of constitutional power in the very people about whom the rulings pertained. Well, it's a similar issue today with this movement. Many of the attempts or the policy goals of the current movement are to transition a lot of power from the federal government to state legislatures. So it's a similar kind of marriage of political interests.
Notice you said state legislature. This is a critical point. It's not the state. It's not the duly elected governor. It's not the Supreme Court. So when you have the independent state legislature theory, that's not about the state or the populist view of people in the state. It is granting the power to grossly gerrymandered state legislatures to do that and to run these conventions. So I think people really have to not let them get away with saying, oh yeah, sounds good, the states maybe do a better job. That's not what they're really saying.
Yeah, I want to come back to this theme, which is whether the danger here is a faction co-opting a state legislature, which is one way to read your book, and that what we need when we get to reforms in a few minutes is something that would bring the people of the state into the picture to help guard against that kind of factionalism. But then there's another theme that in your remarks you both sort of touched on earlier, which is that that much of what we learn in constitutional law, and I'm guilty of this as well to some degree, is justifications for judicial review, the outcomes of judicial review in the wake of the Warren Court. And if so much is in fact predicated on judicial action, for example, we look at our Constitution and nowhere does it mention democracy, right? Nowhere does it mention a guarantee of a right to vote. No church and state is not explicitly mentioned. No power is given to explicitly to regulate things like healthcare, climate change, etc. Right? There's a lot that our document does not, in terms of resembling a modern constitution compared to other countries. So there's this other thing. What judges give, then judges can take away, as we've suddenly learned pretty recently. Brings us back to, I think, ultimately Article 5.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so now let's come back to one of the themes of your book, though, which is that you're really worried about what you see on the right, mm-hmm. this risk of factional co-optation of this convention provision. Talk a little bit about that, because ironically, the high threshold for ratification, right, is a potential check against that, unless you don't think so.
Well, first, you want me to first talk about what we see as a risk, and then you want to talk about...
And then we could do process.
Yeah, talk about the three-quarters.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the three-quarters bar, again, it's often the three-quarters bar is often mentioned as a panacea. Like, we don't really need to worry about what's happening. That this current movement, it's a fringe movement, which is how it has long been discussed. And we don't really have to worry about it because they'll never achieve anything of note. And, we can debate as a political matter whether or not that's true, but I think there are even greater concerns about the process of Article 5. Let me give you an example. So we've never held a convention under Article 5, and thus there is no settled procedure, no law, and really no usable historical precedent from which we can glean understandings of settled legal questions about how the convention functions, who goes to the convention, or even a more basic understanding of who does the convention even represent? What constitutes it? So, for example, the current movement has divined, really from thin air, a whole new theory of Article 5, and arguably the Constitution itself, and they claim quite vehemently that Article 5 conceives not of a convention of people, but a convention of sovereign states. They claim that the convention should be understood in a very Articles of Confederation understanding, that at the convention, every state gets one vote, regardless of population, that state legislatures, as kind of the decision-making body of a sovereign entity decide who goes, and that the people, as any reasonable understanding of direct popular control, have no say in the matter. Well, this clearly is at odds, at best and at worst, completely anathema to the Constitution and our constitutional history. So you might say, well, these are crazy theories, who cares, right? Nonetheless, if a convention is convened and these theories are implemented without being checked, which they really haven't been checked that much, you're encoding into our public discourse and arguably our law whole new theories of the Constitution and, troublingly, theories about constitutional change. And so that's a core concern. And there are many other questions, who goes, under what rules it operates, and even whether or not it can be limited, which is a topic that is on which there's vigorous disagreement.
So, how likely is this? Well, there has already been a resolution offered, filed in the House of Representatives by Texas Congressman Arrington, saying that there are already enough applications based on we consider incorrect combination of applications. And he's saying that Congress has been remiss in not doing its duty, which is to call the convention. As you have heard, there's an election in a week. And if a certain party becomes in charge of the House or the Senate, there is nothing to stop them from simply asserting that there's enough. It's time for a convention. We don't believe the Supreme Court has the authority nor the willingness to stop it. And so all of a sudden we could be in a tremendous constitutional crisis. And if they have their way, I should say it that way, not that it would certainly be that way, but it's likely, it would look something like this. The chapter 5 is entitled, What Trump and the Tea Party Couldn't Do. That's their language. And my former colleague, Rick Santorum, puts
He's on
it
TV a lot, isn't he?
Yes, and not my favorite colleague, but my colleague. He says, because he works for these guys now, he works for the ridiculously named Convention of the States, because there is no such thing as a convention.
They've contrived this
They've made this
phrase.
up. He works for this group, and he says, we're planning on putting resources, people in place to get where the safety's off, and we have a live weapon in our hands. I think that's a quote from James Madison. No, it's not. He would not have talked that way in Philadelphia.
Such reverence for the
The
Constitution.
Constitution is grenade.
So it's a grenade. Yeah, exactly. So, and this is how they're thinking of it. So, but they're working on this. We can laugh, and it is somewhat laughable, but it's actually not. They have been training very carefully for this. In September 2016, over 100 state legislatures from all 50 states gathered in Williamsburg, Virginia for a constitutional war game. The enemy, the federal government. The warriors, a who's who of the hard right establishment. The battlefield, Article 5. Yes, they did have a video with a guy dressed up as George Washington saying, you're going to make history just like we did. And, some of our progressive friends made fun of them as being silly. But this was not silly. Even to a casual observer, the debate would have been impressive. Delegates, the vast majority of whom were conservative Republicans, aligned with the Tea Party movement, approached the affair seriously and engaged in good faith debate. Working committees parsed amendment text, weighed the legal meaning of certain terms and phrases, and hashed out draft proposals. And of course they voted. And of course, as Peter said, how did they vote? Not by the basis of all the delegates, but one vote per state, the Electoral College on steroids. And so people can say, well, Russ and Peter, what are you worried about? What do you think they're going to do? Well, I imagine if they had the chance, they'd ban all abortions and they'd ban gay marriage. But that is actually not at the core of what this movement appears to be about. This is about neutering the federal government. And so the things that they actually passed were first, a restriction on Congress's lawmaking authority to a tiny fraction of its current extent. There's no chance we've been able to deal with COVID as a nation under that scenario. Secondly, they would gut the power of the federal agencies, which of course has been a tremendous priority of the Federal Society and others for years. How would the EPA address climate change and clean water? They would prohibit the income tax. Even after we the people of this country decided through Article 5, after the Supreme Court said this income tax was unconstitutional, they passed the 16th Amendment during the Progressive era to do so. And finally, their favorite. Ferris says this is his favorite. I call it the John C. Calhoun Amendment. If 30 state legislatures, I'm going to pound on this, legislatures, not the people of the state, simply vote to overturn a congressional act signed by the president, or a federal regulation, it's null and void. This is what they want to do to our Constitution. So, no, it's not just about what we're concerned about from substance. In fact, that's not our main point, but I think it's important to realize what they're up to.
And also,
Go ahead.
just to give you some color on this about, who's involved, which I think itself is kind of a little bit of a lens into why it's so troubling. So, many of these individuals, prior to January 6th, you might not have heard their name, but now they've been in the news a lot. People like John Eastman, who now is facing potentially some severe legal issues regarding one memo he wrote. Well, he's also written memos about this, claiming that these new imagined understandings of Article 5 are legally sound. Jenna Ellis, one of the previous president's election attorneys. And I think perhaps most troublingly, Steve Bannon, The Guardian, ran ran an article, I believe, last week about Senator Santorum was on Steve Bannon's podcast, in which Steve Bannon said that he saw the next frontier. And I think this is an interesting thing for you to ponder. I did, at the very least, when I watched Mr. Bannon's podcast, which I can't say I'm a normal listener. Why is it that someone like Steve Bannon, who I don't know if he normally likes law or thinks much about these kind of long play legal processes, why is it like someone like him would be so interested in this Article 5 convention process? It's a pretty wonky topic. It lacks some of the oomph that he might desire in other ways. And I can only come away with the understanding that what they really desire is chaos, and that they know full well that these important legal questions are unanswered, and that were this convening called, this vacuum of uncertainty will lead to a true crisis, and one that we believe really can't be resolved. Congress, we would say, can't regulate a convention. It doesn't make much legal sense. I mean, the convention clearly was conceived of as a mechanism for bottom-up control, as Russ explained, this kind of compromise between sole congressional authority and a bottom-up control. So it would make no sense to think that Congress could somehow, through implementing legislation, set rules. And likewise, it would be troubling and likewise make little sense to think that a court could somehow control it. I mean, this is supposed to be a pure manifestation of popular sovereignty. So we're in this weird interspace, and the potential for a real crisis is looming in our regard, and that's why we end the book where we do, talking about reform. It's not that conventions are bad. In a lot of ways, a convention will be great, but we have to answer some of these questions, like some of the most basic ones, like who does the convention speak for?
I do want to get to the reforms you guys suggest, which are interesting to think about. But let me push back on this, though. Let's assume that what you say is correct, which is that there is an organized right-wing effort to capture Article 5 and to write the Constitution the way they would prefer it. And let's stipulate that it's also true that there's no court and Congress, even if it tried to regulate that convention process, probably couldn't do it legally. Isn't the right answer then that we get everyday people and progressives mobilized now and actually, in an ironic way, join the effort to call for a convention and swamp whatever organizing is already happening on the right? That is to say, we should be joining efforts to call for a convention and talking about all the things that need to be modernized in our Constitution. Isn't that the best strategy?
Well, if it was in fact something that involved like a national election where you would seek votes on a one-person basis across the country, yes, but that's not how the delegates would be chosen. ALEC, you know, the legislative organization of the right, has written a standard document that is being passed by horribly gerrymandered legislatures in places like Wisconsin and Missouri that say this is how the delegates will be selected as a matter of state law. And they will select them, and they will be their colleagues, the people that are being trained.
And if they,
So-
and if they vote against, in some states, they've actually, this I think is another one of these little moments, Bannon, and also this, that make you think, whoa. Some states have amended their criminal codes, and they've now, as state legislatures, and they've added provisions about Article 5. And they've said that if a delegate goes to an Article 5 convention and votes against the will of the state legislature, there are many penalties, some of which are criminal. It can be a felony. West Virginia, I believe, if a delegate votes against the will of the state legislature, it's a $100,000 fine and multiple years in the state penitentiary.
But we think this is a ruse.
Sure.
We
yeah.
believe that there is no teeth to that at all.
But there could be. It has a lot of power. I mean,
But we don't think.
whether or not it's just, you could be raised in court.
But we
yeah.
don't think the convention topic can be limited in this way.
Right.
This is what they use it for, to say, well, we're gonna just have balanced budget amendment, we're just gonna have term limits. Don't worry, because we have these penalties and we'll recall these people. Well, this doesn't feel.
But they
like-
really want the runaway convention.
Of course. And so I think you and I agree that it's kind of a ruse.
I think so, but I think to Professor Tsai's point about, you know, should those of us who, and I would say we both would hold this view, that we sorely need constitutional reform in this country. I mean, read the front page of the newspaper every day. I mean, it's to me, and being kind of our age, I see it as almost an existential problem. And that's in part why we wrote the book about we need this kind of reform. But we need to be thinking intently about the process. And is it at all likely that the process as being currently envisioned, which we can debate its legitimacy, we would say it's the way it's being envisioned is wrong. Is there truly any likelihood that it would bring constitutional debate to the kind of high platform that one would desire, that we would actually have a serious debate about the nature of the Constitution, about the nature of our political life, and have the kind of reform that it would be healthy? And I just don't see any reasonable belief that that would be the case.
And I just want to emphasize, though, in response to the professor's point, what I'm saying is, you're not going to be, no matter how many doors you knock on, how many people you campaign for, in gerrymandered state legislatures, you're not going to win. You're not going to pick the delegates. Some from some states will be progressive, obviously, if they attend New York. But that's what's going to happen. So it won't be like there'll be statewide referendums. It should be that the legislature says, we're going to have people run for delegate and you get to vote. That's sort of the kind of thing that we would like to see done.
Sure.
But that's not what's going to happen under the current system. In fact, it's impossible because the Supreme Court is not going to touch political gerrymandering. So unless these states sort of change their nature and somehow there's a, you know, let's say in Kansas where they did this terrific thing on abortion, they somehow decided to elect rational, rights-oriented legislators. If that happened, yes, maybe I could see that. But the current environment does not seem to me to be one where it's even remotely possible that you'd have a balanced convention.
Okay, it sounds like what you guys are saying is that it would be foolhardy at this point for progressives to join that effort, that given the way things are right now, that would lead to, there's no way we could avoid a factional convention or a runaway convention unless that Article 5 aspect is modified
Correct.
in some way.
And you're also, I think another concern I have is you're legitimizing a lot of these really troubling reimaginations of constitutional authority. I mean, the whole notion that an Article 5 convention is a manifestation of an Articles of Confederation notion of state sovereignty is itself troubling. So if that's the language under which the convention is theorized, by giving it that kind of legitimacy, you're in many ways reframing the whole notion of American popular sovereignty, which has long been contested. But I think it's attempting to assert a very clear answer that I would say is ahistorical at best.
While we were waiting, Peter said to me, we just got a request for an interview from the New Republic. Great. What does it say? We want to talk to you about the Convention of the States. In other words, they've already
This vocabulary.
inserted this language, which is just dead wrong, into the lexicon.
Right. And so it's, yeah.
And at odds with the founding discourse as well.
Completely.
Right.
Absolutely. It's the sovereignty of the people. Well, we don't have a lot of time. I want to make sure that there's room for a little bit of questions from the crowd. But at the end of your book, you've got a list of sort of suggested reforms, sort of you presented as, well, here's a list of things that we think people should think about.
Right.
If each of you could just like sort of pick one that you think is the most important, that if you could get that one thing done, you'd be very happy, or at least would put us on a better road, what would be that one thing?
Well, first of all, across the river, got a hard time from Professor Lessig, who believes in the convention. Not directly, but he's actually the guy that arranged for me to teach over there once. But he says that, Feingold especially and Prindiville should know that how are you going to get 2/3 of Congress to reform Article 5? And that's not an easy question to answer. But we think it has to be done, and somehow there has to be some kind of bipartisan commission that would do this. So the one I would pick is the first one. We would propose that instead of ratification by the state legislatures or conventions selected by the legislature, we would propose the ratification of proposed amendments by popular referendum, but requiring both a majority vote in a sufficient number of states, as the great Wisconsin Senator Fighting Bob LaFollette had proposed, but also a majority vote of all qualified voters nationwide. So there would still be a federalist type state-oriented piece, but it would be popular, but there would also be a national popular vote, because we certainly are not people, and there are very distinguished scholars who believe that constitutionalism is dead. We do not. We believe that you have to have some kind of fundamental law that is distinguished from the day-to-day law, so that people actually have what Jefferson wrote are unalienable rights. But that, to me, is pretty important.
So let me just add, this is interesting. So turning the ratification process, adding the national referendum as a ratification process would do two things. One, it would potentially solve your problem, which is the concern about the state legislatures being co-opted or corrupted to think only about factional concerns. The people across the country would vote. The other things would put us closer in alignment with other countries that do ratification that way. So France, Chile, for example. So what about you?
Well, and also the states. We took a lot in the fourth part of the book. We asked, again, we kind of pick up the question we started with in the beginning about what does this American conception of constitutionalism mean practically in the realm of constitutional amendment? And we argued that we often focus too much just on the federal Constitution, but in reality, we have 50, 53, 54 different ongoing experiments in American constitutionalism. So we should also look to the states and look at the development, the iterative development of state constitutional amendment mechanisms. The overwhelming majority of state constitutions place the constitutional authority directly in the hands of the people, as would be expected in any country that makes a bold claim of popular sovereignty.
You got to pick your favorite.
I know.
Or at least
He's thinking about it. He's filibustering.
Another reform that we're going to do.
Oh, the delegates should be popularly elected. So
Delegates themselves.
yeah,
Okay.
because
chosen by the
again,
states.
right, we don't want the state legislatures to have this inordinate power. And also, you could have, again, thinking about the states. This is what brought me to the states. There have been examples of very successful state constitutional conventions in recent memory. Montana, for example, in the 70s, held a state constitutional convention that was, by all accounts, very well done and yielded arguably one of the most progressive state constitutions in the country. And it was a bottom-up, really, revolution against the moneyed interests of corporate mining power in Montana, and an initial state constitution that had really baked in a lot of kind of pro-corporate policies that people thought were doing a lot of harm to this state government. So their popularly elected delegates were able to really get at the kind of constitutional debate one would hope for, returning to these first principles in a way that was useful and productive.
You might want to look at, you may have heard of the Chilean, what's going on in Chile, which, even though it was defeated, this is a fascinating example of how this can be done. And they may be back with another proposal that could pass. So it gives you a living image of maybe how the right kind of thing could work.
Right.
It's a great example. So let's take some questions. Who's got a question? If you do, raise your hand and come on, don't let this chance pass you by. Yes, say your name too for us.
My name is Eric. My question has to do with the state map. You were talking about 2/3. It seems to me that the states and create it's simple majority. Or the now times of politics, like the control, the check. Politics. I'm wondering if that is a more plausible threat. Or if I just like not understanding like why.
Well, there should be more states created, obviously.
DC.
District of Columbia, Guam, and Rico and others, but yes, they could respond, but it's not easy. Yes, it's easy in the sense that it's a majority vote of both houses, but you got a president over there, and this is one where you might like to filibuster if they start deciding that Bakersfield and the Central Valley are gonna be a state, which, is kind of what they're talking about. Or dividing, Texas into 5 pieces so they could have 10 senators, I don't think it's as immediate as a problem because it has to go through the normal congressional process, which obviously doesn't work anymore, generally speaking. So it's a shame because some of these places, it's absurd that they're not represented. I think this is more immediate. But you're right that it could become part of the strategy about this. I'd never thought of that. Interesting.
Very interesting. I'd also, just one of my pet theories, I think the state accession procedure is yet another reason where we can glean constitutional meaning to make it clear that Article 5 doesn't provide a convention of states. The states have no say about whether or not a new state accedes to the Union. It's Congress. Right, so if it truly was, if we truly had a confederation, it'd be like any kind of legal partnership. All the members would have to agree to add somebody new to the partnership. That's not how it works.
Other questions? Yep.
I'm wondering if you thought more about what.
Well, there are many good examples, and this was actually, again, a topic of real robust debate and a lot of academic scholarship in the 70s, when there was a flourishing of state constitutional conventions. I mentioned Montana. Illinois is another great example where I'm from. Our current constitution was drafted by convention in 1970. And so I think, again, the states are a good place to look for what does this look like practically. And how has, again, these American understandings of constitutional change, how have they been implemented in practice? And of course, there are many examples abroad as well, and we discussed this in the book, but Chile is a great example. Obviously, it failed, right? The convention's handiwork was rejected by the voters, but that in and of itself isn't dispositive in my mind. I mean, they still successfully held a convention that drafted a document that, at least in the mind of the delegates, was what was needed. And that is the kind of constitutional debate we should be hoping for.
You talked a little bit about some of the substantive changes that might occur. From a procedural perspective, would you anticipate that, if a convention is successfully called, would the people involved in that in some way try to make it more difficult to do the same thing again so that they can sort of entrench their own vision of what the Constitution should be and sort of engage in a process of building a ladder up and then throwing it away once they get to the top?
They could, but then of course they're still going to want to have 3/4 of the states ratify. So you have to calculate whether going too far would be problematic in that regard. And a lot of people say, well, you need 38 states, so how are you ever going to get that? Well, you need 34 to just call the thing. So, but then when you start saying, well, we're going to lock this in unless 90% of the states, I think that's strategically, they could. There would be nothing that would stop them from proposing it.
And
the content is open.
I would say that Article 5 reform is undoubtedly a topic that would be raised at a convention. If you look historically at the applications that have been submitted to Congress, these are the actual legal instruments that are used to apply. It's like akin to a statute, but it's not, or a resolution. A good percentage of them have been about Article 5 itself, which I think is quite fascinating. State legislatures have said, we want a convention to reform Article 5. And so I don't think, and this goes back to the 60s, really. Again, it's part of the Article 5 backlash to the Warren Court. But again, during the progressive era, the example that Russ mentioned about, a requisite majority in all the states and also a popular vote, that was actually a proposed constitutional amendment modeled off. That was introduced in Congress by Bob La Follette, one of
So
the
Wisconsin
leading,
was progressive.
one of the leading progressive voices.
Back in the day.
And
There's actually more reason too, but.
and so it's an interesting topic that debate about Article 5 reform has ironically been one of the most discussed proposed changes through Article 5, and in a lot of ways we're carrying on the tradition.
Indeed. Okay, there are a couple other hands. Yes, here.
Let's say in a limitless convention situation, are there any ideas to like maybe filibuster the entire situation where you just
At the convention?
at the convention just
Yeah, I would say that one of the delegates would say, Mr. Chairman, regular order, please. And the liberals would scream bloody murder, and they would say, I call the question, and then these right-wing state senators would vote it down, and they'd go ahead. They can make up their own rules about the procedure. If they want to create a filibuster for lefties, that'd be great, but I'm guessing they won't.
That's why the representation is so, is so key.
Because it would be skewed. In theory, of course, they could.
To your question before about why don't, and this is a common argument, and I take it seriously. Well, why don't we just join them? In any legal institution, most definitely a drafting legislative institution, the rules matter, and they're often dispositive. We don't know how parliamentary rules would be created. And if we truly are adopting this one state, one vote theory, it's totally reasonable to think that the body could act on parliamentary questions by simple majority vote. So 26 state delegations could end debate. 26 state delegations could approve draft amendments and send to the state and adjourn the convening. So I think, that's the frame in which you need to think about it.
Yeah, we put in the book that the magic number isn't necessarily 38, it's not necessarily 34, it's 26.
What if we had a Democratic-controlled Congress at that point, a democratically controlled presidency, and Congress said, okay, we accept that it's time to call a convention, but our understanding of the theory of the convention looks like this. It's not the basis of the states, but the basis of the people. And we also are going to change the rules because there's no rules laid down anyway about how this, other than the state ratification part. We think that if we actually have a true Article 5 convention, not even that provision in Article 5 can constrain the people. So if the people decide to rewrite it, then our model is the 1787 Constitution.
Well, Sam Ervin, when things were getting very close with the Dirksen Amendment draft, Senator Sam Ervin, North Carolina, he drafted up a series of
Legislation,
legislation that would purport to create these rules. And actually, we do propose that there be constitutional authority.
We propose that Article 5 be amended to allow Congress to do what you want, but right now we would say they can't because it.
But that would be something Congress probably would try to do, and then we'd be in this no man's land that Peter describes, which is why would the convention adhere to it on the belief that they can't? And who's going to stop the convention? We don't think the Supreme Court will.
So even what's clearest is the ratification thing you can't change.
Right.
But the selection of delegates, maybe.
There are some who claim that you can change on the sort of anti-convention side, who claim they could even change the convention. I mean the ratification piece. We do not make that argument.
No.
The other point, just to, and
please.
this gets really detailed fast, but some people claim, again, and just to zoom out, because you can get lost in the minutia of this very quickly, And I think it's important to remember the big picture, which is the fact that the minutia exist and there's real debate about it, and there's good arguments on both sides, is itself an example, it's itself emblematic of what's wrong. We shouldn't have to be debating these questions. It's like the ERA. It's a problem, in my view, that is being litigated, whether or not the ERA has been successfully ratified. It's just another element of what's wrong with Article 5. All of these uncertainties are problematic.
A couple questions, yeah, a couple questions. Jacob, and then there was like one more in the background.
So I know that we've gotten a lot into the weeds of the functions of the function of the convention, but I want to talk about what happens before the convention, right? How in the interim we are going to be stop the right-wingers from successfully getting to the point of the convention. In what you've been saying a lot about gerrymandering. Senator, I think you have very interesting perspective coming from Wisconsin on that issue. But despite this, it's primarily like left-leaning states and appointing kind of idiosyncratic state supreme courts that don't necessarily promote gerrymandering and kind of neuter the left's ability or champions of democracy's ability really to keep their own folks in power. So my question is there an interim solution here that involves playing hardball on our end, exploiting existing institutions, honestly inherently opposed to kind of what the central
Well, on this particular one, you have to do something about the composition of the state legislatures. And which is a horrible victim of gerrymandering, was the one that took it to the Supreme Court. And we got creamed. And they said political gerrymandering is fine. So not only you could play as much hardball as you want, but I don't know how you get around that without a constitutional amendment, probably saying that you can't do this. So specifically, what we believe might happen in Wisconsin next week, we already have, of course, in 2018, we elected a progressive governor, lieutenant governor, treasurer, and attorney general. And we lost ground in the state legislature. That's impossible, almost. They believe that next week, Republicans may get a veto-proof legislature, being able to override the governor even if he happens to get reelected. And they're going to do it potentially with 44% of the vote because of what they've done. So maybe you have ideas about how you disrupt something like that, but that is exceedingly difficult.
And you have a gubernatorial candidate in Wisconsin who said that if he wins, Democrats will never win elections ever again.
How
So-
much more you can do to gerrymander.
Right. But to practical questions about what you can do, talk to your state legislatures.
Indeed.
They have this power. They're the ones voting on these applications. Even if you have a Democratic state legislator who you think is predisposed to perhaps oppose this movement, talk to them nonetheless. Explain some of these concerns. And especially in my home state of Illinois, I'm represented almost exclusively at the state level by Republicans. And I did talk to my state legislator about this. And I said, and I would encourage you to say, how do you know that state legislatures control this convening? How do you know that? Show me the law. Show me the constitutional authority that says that you have that right. Show me where it says that you know who will go to this convention. They can't. They can't show it to you because there is no authority. Now, in some states, Wisconsin, other states, they might say, well, we have these publications. They might point you to ALEC publications, which are the most common kind of cited authority for all these crazy positions. ALEC is a political action group that has very clear ideological aims. It's not legal, it's not law. And so I would just encourage you to ask your legislators, how do you know what you know?
And to follow on your point, we tell the story in the prologue of Montana.
Right.
Where they're probably going to pass it now, but a Republican state senator, a woman, became very irate at the so-called whining and dining that the Convention of the States people were doing. And
All behind closed doors. Where are the people there?
she was being threatened, said she almost resigned from the state Senate. She voted no. with the Democrats and a couple other Republicans, so it was defeated. So and here's the part I don't love bringing up. The John Birch Society and the Eagle Forum are against convention too. And they are able in some of these places to convince right-wing legislators to not do this because they're afraid that a right to abortion would be put in or whatever. So, but if your question is great and your answer was great, Peter, which is next week, you'll be voting for people and, you know, you might be able to even convince some conservative Republicans that this isn't the time to be doing this. So the battle is at the state legislative level, even in potentially a gerrymandered, possibly, but it's very difficult.
I think even in Wisconsin, some Republicans voted. I'd have to check the vote records, but there have been many Republicans who vote no in some of these.
He always brags that his state saw all this stuff coming. And Illinois repealed all of the applications they've ever done, which I thought was kind of.
I sense a little competitive spirit here.
Just a
Between the
little
others,
Well, you know, it's La
we
Follette,
got one more
Dirksen,
question.
we've got the.
Time for one more question in the back, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah.
I think it's a combination of things, some of which Peter was talking about, which is the sort of attitude that this isn't really a serious threat. But there's another strategic attitude, which is don't talk about it too much. It might encourage it. I can tell you that Common Cause and a coalition is working hard to keep track of what's happening in each state legislature. We get at ACS notices of, you know, where they think there's going to be a vote and how close it's going to be. So, but no, is there a widespread movement against it? No. But we think we weren't trying to create a movement, but we believe the effect of this book, with the New York Times covering, with the Guardian, with Bannon coming out, is that we've sort of exposed what they're doing a little before they wanted. They have purposely in the past and now called for a hushed effort. And so we think maybe things are going to start changing.
There's an anecdote in the book that we like to tease out because I think it's really demonstrative. So we came very close to calling a convention in the 80s to consider a balanced budget amendment, purportedly. And the movement failed because as it got closer and closer to the requisite number, people started paying a lot of attention to it. And one of the proponents of a convention, conservative in the 80s, he said that they had tried to keep it hush, and they were sad when people started, they were, perturbed when people started considering the question more intently, because they had tried to convince state legislators that the applications were, in his words, quote, as meaningful as a resolution endorsing apple pie. And I think that this was a deep learning of the 80s. And it's really a continuation of the same movement, that it's best to keep this hushed, don't talk about it, and when you do talk about it, make all these questions about the true authority of a convention, all of these unanswered legal questions, kind of just elide them all, because really it'll never happen. And then we get more states, we get more valid applications, and all of a sudden it gets to a point where you can't pull it back anymore. You've gotten, the momentum is there. And so I think a lot of it is talk about it, and if it comes up in a state house, go and testify at the hearings, if hearings are even held.
So we're delighted that 30 future lawyers at the Boston University School of Law now know about it. That's why
It's a
we're
slow effort to get the word out there.
Indeed. Listen, allow me to wrap up this wonderful conversation that we've been having. Thanks for staying with us through it. Let me just finish with their own words in the book here on this topic of staying alert as to all the things that are happening. The two authors write, as the people abdicate their amendment responsibilities, sort of our responsibility in a tradition of popular sovereignty, the courts and the president will fill the void out of necessity. Yet however good-willed the initial impulse might be, emboldened by a logic that gives normative weight to historical practice, we've been reminded of that recently, the shift of authority over constitutional meaning can become entrenched in a few institutions, we might even say 5 members of one institution, far from the people. So please join me in thanking Senator Feingold and his co-author, Peter Prindiville, in this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Professor.
Very good.